When the average Westerner thinks of the culture of Jamaica and the Caribbean, the image that comes to mind usually involves leisure and laid-back attitudes, the partaking of a certain non-pharmaceutical drug, reggae music, Bob Marley, dreadlocks, and those funny hats with the colors on them. But what if I were to tell you that this isn't actually the portrayal of mainstream Jamaican culture at all, but rather a fascinating subculture born out of a new religious movement? In fact, in Jamaica, marijuana isn't even legal, contrary to popular belief. What you're thinking of is actually the Rastafarian religious movement, which, yes, has become intrinsically linked to Jamaica, but not all-encompassing by any means. And just by talking to your average Jamaican or West Indian, this becomes readily apparent. So just who are these Rastafarians anyways? How did they get to be so popular and influential in this community, and what exactly do they believe? In today's video, we're going to be discussing some of the history, origin, and inspiration of this unique Abrahamic faith, delve into some of their beliefs, practices, and traditions, and look at the current demographics of the faith. The Rastafarian movement originated with the African diaspora in the Americas, with the largest concentrations being among the Anglophone Caribbean or West Indian territories owned by the British Empire, with the majority of the Afro-Caribbean population adhering to some form of Christianity in the 1800s, predominantly Protestant sects, and various Afro-Caribbean churches began to form in the region with very interesting philosophies, to say the least. The Proto-Rastafarian beliefs are a result of the ethnogenesis of the Pan-African identity forged throughout the Black American and Afro-Caribbean communities, who grew to form their own community from a fusion of a variety of diverse African people who had been transplanted to the Americas for slavery by the British, Spaniards, and other Europeans. And with many of their original languages, religions, and cultural practices eradicated during the colonial era, afterwards their shared African heritage was pretty much the major factor that unified their communities, just as how the white American community also formed from a variety of assimilated European ethnic groups. To many black leaders, they struggled to reconcile their community's Christian faith with black nationalist beliefs, since they saw Christianity as the white man's religion. Kind of strange considering it originated in the Middle East, but eventually many came to reconcile this by learning of Ethiopia, one of the first nations ever to adopt Christianity in the 4th century AD under King Ezana of Aksum. Not only was Christianity quite popular in ancient Ethiopia, but Judaism as well, with many of the royal class of Ethiopia or Abyssinia claiming descent from ancient Israelites, which, hey, does actually have a bit more truth than many would think. And Ethiopia and the rest of the Sahel has long been the genetic and cultural bridge between the Middle East and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Early black churches in the 19th and 20th centuries throughout the British West Indies placed special reverence on ancient and modern Ethiopia, not only as a place of great historical and religious importance, but also because it was one of the few areas of Africa that had yet to be conquered by a European power. Many black leaders, such as Marcus Garvey of Jamaica, promoted a large-scale repatriation of blacks from the Americas back to Africa, which did actually sort of happen with the formation of Liberia in West Africa, but he dreamed of uniting all sub-Saharan Africans under a single, all-encompassing empire, with Ethiopia often being used interchangeably with the region of sub-Saharan Africa. Early Rastafarians, or Rastas as they are called, interpreted parts of the Christian Bible to mean that the next coming of Christ, or the Messiah, would be from Africa, specifically Ethiopia. And upon the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie in the 1930s, the first official Rastafarian church was established in Jamaica by Leonard P. Howell, proclaiming Selassie to be the next embodiment of God on earth and the savior of the African race. Although Ethiopia was invaded and occupied by the Italians in the 1930s, following their defeat and the reinstating of Haile Selassie, this movement was only strengthened further as Ethiopia became the first native African nation to oust European colonizers, and in the coming decades, Emperor Selassie became massively popular in Jamaica, not only among the Rastafarian community, but the general public as well, with Jamaica not gaining independence from the British until 1962. To anyone who knows a fair bit about Ethiopian culture, this may seem strange considering Ethiopia is a predominantly Orthodox Christian nation, with Emperor Selassie being a lifelong Ethiopian Orthodox practitioner and never actually claimed to be the Messiah or embodiment of God, largely concerning himself with internal Ethiopian politics rather than the scores of Rastas who literally worshipped him as a god. So essentially, the early Rastafarian philosophy began as an Afrocentric interpretation of Christianity that formed in the African diaspora of the Caribbean, tied to a variety of religious traditions, especially the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Judaism, and indigenous African religions. Rastafarianism by this point was essentially an organized religion instead of merely a conglomerate of different philosophical and religious beliefs and practices, with it generally considered to be a distinct Abrahamic religion apart from Christianity, meaning it's in the same class as Islam, Judaism, the Baha'i Faith, or Mormonism. Although similar to Mormonism, many Rastas do consider themselves to be Christians, or rather the fulfillment of the Christian prophecies. Now, Rastafarians do believe that Jesus Christ of Nazareth is the original Messiah, which lines up with other Christian adherents. However, they believe that the future coming or reincarnation of Christ would have been in Africa, with Rastas referring to God as Jah, short for Jehovah. Rastafarian practices and culture, which, yes, involves the ritual smoking of cannabis for religious purposes, and the wearing of the traditional Rastafarian cap, or tam, and growing of dreadlocks, was largely propagated by the international fame of reggae music, most famously promoted by Robert Nesta Marley, better known as Bob Marley, who, little known fact, actually had a white British father, which greatly influenced his childhood. And yes, you better believe that I visited the Bob Marley Museum upon my visit to Jamaica a couple years ago, and definitely bought myself a Rasta tam, with the red, green, and yellow colors being associated with the Pan-African movement. Although beloved internationally, Emperor Selassie's rule was not without controversy, with particular scorn directed towards his administration's treatment of certain ethnic minorities in Ethiopia, such as the Harare, and its response to the major famine in the 1970s, which resulted in a Soviet-backed Marxist coup in the country, with Haile Selassie allegedly assassinated in the aftermath. Due to the influence of Bob Marley and other reggae artists, Rastafarian culture became identical to Jamaican and Afro-Caribbean culture to many outsiders, although if you've ever actually been to Jamaica, you'd know that actual Rastafarian practitioners are very distinct in Jamaican society, and although tolerated by the Christian majority, are by no means considered mainstream or an accurate portrayal of Jamaican culture. Rastas in Jamaica and abroad are generally older males of Afro-Caribbean descent, with males outnumbering females in this community 2-to-1, with the community generally reflecting older Abrahamic or Judeo-Christian practices of male-dominated households and communities, with polygamy permitted in some Rasta circles and condemned in others. Although traditionally confined to the Afro-Caribbean people of the British West Indies, the faith has since spread to ethnic minorities in the region, such as those of mixed race, white, Indian, or even Chinese descent, although for all intents and purposes, the core population, similar to Mormonism or Judaism, is largely a strict ethno-religious community. Now, statistics for adherents of Rastafarianism are extremely difficult to come by, but compiling a variety of sources, I've been able to come up with a global demographic snapshot for the religious community. Although it's estimated that up to 5 to 10% of the Jamaican population may have some affiliation or former affiliation with Rastafarianism, currently, judging by official census estimates, only 1% of the population of Jamaica, or roughly 30,000 people, claim to be Rastafarians. Again, probably way lower than most people would assume. And when compared to other Caribbean nations, Jamaica is actually not really that religious, with over a quarter of the population not claiming any religious affiliation. When including all other Caribbean countries, the total Rastafarian population still only jumps to around 60,000, meaning around half of all Rastas in the Caribbean are located in Jamaica, and in Anglosphere Caribbean countries, St. Lucia is the only territory with a percentage above 2%, with most hovering around 1% or less. However, several countries like Barbados, Grenada, Dominica, and St. Vincent having a higher Rasta percentage than Jamaica. In the United States, there may be as many as 26,000 Rastafarian adherents spread throughout the country, especially in New York City, Florida, and other areas of the East Coast and the South, with the community split between native converts and West Indian migrants. This is less than 0.01% of the country's population, yet they're still quite influential in pop culture, especially when pertaining to the Caribbean, and there are also smaller numbers in Canada and the United Kingdom, around 4 and 8,000 each respectively, who similarly have a large association with Afro-Caribbean culture, despite being a small percentage of even the Canadian and British West Indian populations. Estimates vary, but there is a community now of more than a couple thousand Rastafarians in Ethiopia today, mostly Jamaican and West Indian migrants who live predominantly in the city of Shashamane in the center of the country, a portion of which was designated to those in the African diaspora of the Americas by Emperor Selassie himself, today making up around 1% of the city, the largest Rastafarian proportion of any city outside of the Caribbean. Interestingly, many Rastafarians still do discuss and promote the idea of moving to Africa and settling down, especially in Ethiopia, and in other parts of Africa, a sizable convert community has formed, with Rastafarianism having moderate success in southern African Anglophone countries like Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, with perhaps 100,000 Rastas throughout Africa today. Strangely, I have seen sources claim that there are 1 million Rastafarians worldwide. However, even by being extremely generous with my estimations, I came to a figure of no more than 250,000 active practitioners, nowhere near the million figure claimed by some, although this figure could also include those who have only a fledgling affiliation with the religious movement or their practices. This would make it one of the smaller Abrahamic faiths when compared to 3 million Druze, 8 million Baha'is, 15 million Jews, and 17 million Mormons, and yet in spite of this, the Rastafarians have managed to become extremely influential, not only in the African diaspora community worldwide, but also in mainstream American culture, even to the point of becoming synonymous with Jamaican or Caribbean culture in the eyes of many Westerners. In conclusion, Rastafarianism is quite the interesting religious movement today, and although largely associated with Afro-Caribbean culture and society, has had a much larger impact on the world than many, including Emperor Haile Selassie himself, could have ever imagined. So please go and let me know your thoughts on the global Rasta community, and for today's poll, tell me which other traditional African religion you'd like to learn more about. As always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.